Think value for money just means cutting costs? Think again. It's about unlocking smarter, fairer, more effective aid. In this episode, we bust the biggest myths, unpack the 4 E's, and explore how real impact happens when money meets meaning. This is the first episode in our brand new mini-series on aid effectiveness and value for money. Join us for this episode of the Flywheel Economics podcast. Welcome to the Flywheel Economics podcast. Flywheel Economics is a concept that proposes true, sustainable economic growth by viewing economies as ecosystems. I'm your host, Richard O.
And I'm your co-host, Favor Ogbadu. Together, let's explore a more sustainable and powerful way to view innovation, investment, and economic policymaking.
This is the start of a new mini-series on aid effectiveness and value for money. And the first episode that we're going to focus on today is going to be around one of the 4 practices which Flywheel Economics is structured around, which is our aid effectiveness and value for money practice. What this practice does is work with international development programs and helps support them around building various value for money tools to support those programs to be more effective in what they do. So I'm really excited for this episode because we get to showcase a bit of the work that we do. Favor, any thoughts from you before we go to our guest?
Yeah, I'm super excited. I mean, our affordable housing mini-series has been a hit, and this for me is closer to home because, as you said, it's one of our core practice areas. And so it's not just an episode, not saying that any of our previous episodes are just episodes, but this one hits closer to home because we are full hands, legs into this value for money. And so I think we'll be able to bring a fresher perspective in the sense that we are the front lines. And so when we talk, we're talking out of experience. And so I'm super excited, and even more excited to have our guest today because he's not just a guest, happens to be a colleague. Mr. Biswas, happy to have you here. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and just say hi to the Flywheel Economics audience.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be on this episode. Just a little bit of an introduction about myself. I actually worked with Richard at FCDO, previously DFID, for a long time, where I came in as a fast-stream economist and left as a general manager. And I basically went on to do an MBA at Harvard. And through that, I've transitioned into not only independent consulting, but I've done some work in venture capital and tech ESG. So I've got a fairly broad background. And even prior to DFID and FCDO, I did some consulting at Dalberg. And funny enough, actually, Richard was partly my client. So there's a big relationship going back a long time. So pleased to meet you all.
Thank you, Deep. And just to clarify, no conflict of interest here at all.
Happy we have that all clarified. So it's a really exciting episode, as I said. And I'm stealing Richard's chair today because I'm sitting in the host seat. So both Richard and Deep are going to stand in as my guests as the foremost economists that they are, with many years combined, over 25 years of experience in the international development space. I'm happy to be stealing Richard's chair as I'll be the one to steer the conversation. And so the first thought that comes to my mind is that as a taxpayer, when I think value for money, I'm thinking, what's the difference? You people are just saying we should spend less, right? So many people obviously believe that the value for money agenda is the same thing as cost cutting. But if both of you have a different opinion, now is the time to speak. So what is the value for money agenda? How about you go first, Deep?
All right, great. That's a good question. I think there's both an overlap and a difference at the same time. So I think the principle of value for money is actually making sure what you're actually spending your money on is making an effective, essentially a return on what you're spending. And in the process, obviously, if you are spending on programs or projects or entities which aren't delivering impact, you would want to cut them. But at the same time, if you're actually delivering projects and programs and entities that are delivering impact, you could actually argue that you would want to scale it up. So I think here the effect is not necessarily solely negative; it can also be positive, and I think that's a key difference because what we want to avoid as a government, as a country, is to avoid spending money on things that aren't returning impact, whether it's domestically or internationally. But obviously, when we start to think about it more holistically, it's not simply cost cutting. We want to make investments which actually transcend into actual impact that alleviates, in this case, poverty, but it could be a better health system, education system, et cetera, et cetera. So those are my initial thoughts, but happy to chime in as and when needed.
Thank you, Deep. I'll just add in there, I think that's a really nice explanation, particularly with the focus on looking at like investments. To give a slightly different angle on it all, I mean, this idea that value for money is one and the same as cost cutting, which is very, popularly held by a lot of people in the industry. It's about getting the cheapest. People conflate it with getting the cheapest of something. And just like when Deep was describing it as actually about investments and looking at where you get the sort of best return on investment, I think we can put it into our own lives, because we all know that we don't always go for the cheapest of something, because quality also matters to us. But when you're looking at value for money, you're making sure that what you're paying for something has some relationship to the quality of what you're getting, or so whether that's about the quality of expertise that you're bringing on to a project, or whether that's about, as Deep was saying, how big do you go with the investment. So I think while sometimes it can be about cost cutting, a lot of the time it's not. It's about making good strategic choices.
I like that, because that's true. We don't always go for the cheapest. Most times you're thinking, what can I buy that will last me in the long term? And so why is the value for money agenda so important? Richard, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'll just say on this one, there is a school of thought which is, let's just focus on impact, right? Let's just focus on results. That's what really matters. And I think the slight challenge to that is particularly something like international development, where it's not always really clear what the price of achieving a systemic change is, or a big impact, or a long-term impact is. Then you could end up spending an awful lot of money on achieving something which might have been achieved for a lot less. And it's just really difficult to know what the right price for such a transformational change could be. So, for instance, if you're doing a big infrastructure project, maybe it's over 5 years. Is your budget 100 million for that infrastructure project, where maybe you're trying to, strengthen the quality of government systems on roads or power or whatever? Or is your budget 10 million? And what's the right way to go? If you're just focused on results and impact, then you're indifferent to whether you spend 10 million or 100 million, because you're getting the same result at the end of it. But when you've got the value for money agenda, you actually care that you're not just hitting the results, but you're doing it for good value for money. Deep, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I tend to agree. And I think the key thing about why it's so important, coming back to it, is fundamentally is showing to those who are funding it, in this case, the taxpayer, that their contributions into society on an everyday basis is actually being used in a meaningful way. And I say that as a taxpayer because wherever I've been and I've lived abroad, I think in many ways, when you aren't seeing an impact on the taxes you pay, that's when you get large amounts of dissatisfaction with the government at large, right? And we see it in many developing countries, actually, that when those contributions aren't seen, people start to question why they're paying tax in the first place. So in a way, it's showcasing what the money is being used for. But I think what's slightly kind of unique to international development is actually when you look at the amount of studies or impact assessments that are run in international development is actually quite disproportionate, and it doesn't get told. That story doesn't get told at large. And I think I saw a stat where I think aid forms only roughly 1% of all expenditure, but if you actually look at the percentage of studies that are being run, I think it's slightly north of 10%. So you can see a disproportionate emphasis on this, and I think oftentimes it's because it's perceived that a lot of that money is being spent outside of the UK, whereas we should be actually thinking about this more holistically, even beyond international aid, on some of the programs we're doing in the UK. And so I think value for money, although typically and oftentimes it's associated with aid, amongst other things, it can be in all multitudes of life. And actually, when you start to think of it even more broadly beyond government, the private sector does it too, right? They call it KPIs, they call it balanced scorecard. It's almost exactly the same. And so I think what it really showcases is that when we had an international aid department as a distinct entity, and now as part of FCDO, um, it takes itself really seriously and it's holding itself to principles that are widely admired all over the world. And I think, Richard, you might be able to speak to some of that, particularly on DFID's previous reputation, but more generally, I think even still, the UK actually in many ways has pioneered some of this thinking methodology, and it is something to be told and celebrated, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Deep. I'll just build on that a little bit because you've given me a nice segue into it. But and I won't say which party or which minister, but one of the ministers that had for DFID that had worked in the private sector, worked for a FTSE 100 company. He came in and spoke very frankly to staff and said, "Look, I worked in this big private sector company. If something intuitively felt worth doing, we wouldn't question it. We would just go ahead and do it. But the standard here is higher because I know I've got to go and defend this in Parliament. So it's not just about, do I feel with my gut that this is a good thing to do or to be intuitive about it? Like, to be honest, a lot of companies work that way. As much as they have KPIs and try and be rigorous on it, there's still a lot of things where if something is feels self-evident to be good to do, they'll go ahead and do it, right? Because they don't have time to do the analysis or to do the whatever. They see, does it work? It seems to work. It seems to be something worth doing. Let's put money and invest in it. Let's not overanalyze. But he said the standard is higher here because I've got to stand up in Parliament and show why this was a good use of taxpayer money. And therefore, that's why we need all this kind of architecture beneath it. That's why we need this rigor that comes into it. So I think it's a really good point that you make, Deep. But I would argue that even perhaps the standard is higher than in the private sector because of that scrutiny that the money gets put under from taxpayers. You don't have to just satisfy yourselves who are running the organization. You've got to be able to satisfy the public as well.
Thanks, Richard. So just staying on your thought about the architecture and the rigor that goes into value for money in international development. I remember being on my first international development project and understanding, okay, yes, this is what value for money is. I understand it, but what does it look like in practice? What are we actually supposed to help these people to do? And I think that's what I would like to go into next. We have defined what value for money, we have defined what the value for money agenda means, but how do we capture VFM in practice? Deep?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think oftentimes value for money can not only happen before an aid program has actually been created, so in the business case development stage, where you're actually justifying to a minister or the foreign secretary or any other stakeholder for that matter why the programming should take place. But it can also happen once programming has actually started and you're evaluating whether the program on an ongoing basis is performing well. Actually, lastly, to come to think of it, can also be done post the program has actually been completed, because you take lessons from that for future programming and future entities that you might create. So it can really happen at any stage of that life cycle. And Richard, you might want to come in on practically how that starts to look like. But it is a much more careful and well thought out process, and it's framework led. That's the key thing that people should know.
Yeah, thanks, Deep. That's a really helpful way in. So I don't think we can talk about value for money without explaining a bit about results frameworks and logical frameworks, because the value for money agenda very much builds on the log frame and the results frameworks, which have been so popularly used in development since the late 1960s. So the log frame is a linear framework, which looks to explain how inputs become outputs, outputs become outcomes, outcomes become impact. and it follows it through in a logical and mostly linear way. The log frame didn't originate in a village meeting or an NGO workshop. It emerged from Cold War logic, right? And was propelled onto the global stage by Robert McNamara. So Robert McNamara was a US Secretary of Defense, and this was during the Cold War. He championed systems analysis and management by objectives to run the Pentagon like a corporation. That's how he wanted to do things, right? So it was all about having these kind of logical flows through everything they managed. When he became president of the World Bank in 1968, he brought this same technocratic mindset to development, demanding measurable results, clear objectives, and rigorous planning. There was Deep, I don't know if I should name this, but a former chief economist for DFID, he once said he went on a trip to visit I believe it was like the Chinese state planning organization. And when he came back from the Chinese state planning organization, he made a little quip to staff that he felt that DFID was doing more planning than the Chinese state planning department was. And, he said it with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but I think because we have this degree of planning and systems and logical chains and all the rest of it, which comes through on the back of this legacy from Robert McNamara and what was happening with USAID and the World Bank back in the late 1960s. So under his leadership, the log frame became the blueprint for project design, and not just that, also for implementation, and it's a legacy that still shapes how aid is delivered and evaluated today. So that's the logical framework, right? Inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact, and they all build from each other. Now, once you have that framework, you can go a step further because you're actually looking at the costs which are associated with each, and also so you've got looking at inputs, for example. What's the economy associated with those inputs? So how much are you paying for those inputs? And what does that look like? How good is the economy that you're getting from the purchase of those inputs? You can look at how those inputs are transformed into outputs. So you can see what the efficiency is of the resources that you're putting in. And then, of course, you can go to how those outputs are then leading to outcomes. Now, outputs tend to be tangible results or things which are very much within your control, whereas outcomes tend to be results which are influenced by a whole host of factors that can be some of which will be outside of your control. So the outputs can influence the outcome, but there tends to be other things that you need in order for the outcome to happen as well. And when you're looking at the journey between the outputs to the outcome, you're looking at the effectiveness of what you're doing. And of course, you can take a step back and bring it all together and look at the overall cost effectiveness of what you're doing. So that's a very long-winded way of saying you can't look at value for money unless you're also looking at the results agenda, and you can't look at the results agenda unless you look at results frameworks and you go back to the late 1960s and look at how systems management or systems analysis and management by objectives in the Pentagon then starts to move across into international development. Deep, I don't know if you want to add in anything on the back of that, anything I've missed.
No, I think that I would largely agree with all of that. I think the thing that the listener should also kind of be aware of is that it's both scientific and an art at the same time, right? So you're trying to basically create a canvas, say, of a painting. And if you don't have the tools to put on the right strokes onto the canvas, you're going to end up with a painting that can't be, digested at all. But at the same time, it's not to say that once you get the paint, that all paintings are going to look exactly the same. It will look very different. So I think in the process of creating such frameworks or methodology, you can obviously reference other examples and other use cases where similar activities have taken place. And that can stand as a baseline for what you may or may not expect. But then there's obviously the actual contextual interpretation of where it's happening, what is going on. And again, as Richard has alluded to, as you get further and further along, particularly on the cost effectiveness, there are judgment calls, because quite often there are multiple stakeholders who are maybe doing similar programming, and there starts to become questions of attribution, contribution. Different people call it different things, but it makes it overall really complex. But I think that's where economists such as Richard and I often do help, because coming back to all of this, the key thing, it's framework-led logical thinking. And I think for a lot of people who are just not familiar with it, it becomes really difficult to put it all together in that way. So I think that's what I would say to add to what you've said, Richard. But again, please do chip in.
I'll just build on what you're saying, because I really like you drawing attention to the sort of, it's not just a science, or it's not a science really, it's art and science coming together, right? It's sort of, and I would build on that by saying what we often tell clients where we do value for money frameworks with is that we're not trying to do this high definition photograph with our value for money framework. It's more like an impressionistic painting. It's something that should capture the essence of what you're trying to achieve without being so constraining that you're trying to, map everything or all the rest of it, because it becomes unwieldy and unmanageable, particularly when you've got really complex programs which are doing multiple things and they're working with quite big budgets. It's not possible to map everything. So you're trying to get to the key, the essence of what drives value in that program, and being able to map that through. So I really like the kind of arts and science dichotomy that you brought in there, because it's trying to be both, right? It's trying to add a bit more of a framework behind trying to understand where the value is coming from in the program and where the costs are coming from in the program as well.
Now, to non-economists like myself, I hope you are not getting scared or intimidated. Firstly, when I discovered the whole framework at first, it was like, okay, what is going on here? But eventually, just as Deep and Richard said, when you go beyond the science, you see the art and it begins to make sense. And we've talked about the beauty of the result framework, about the beauty of the log frame, and how essentially it's interwoven with the value for money agenda. But my question is, why not just push for results then? Isn't that what it's all about? Why are we still talking about value for money?
So just to come in again, because I used the example earlier about the infrastructure program that could either cost 100 million or it could cost 10 million, and you just don't know what the right answer is. The other example I'd like to give is just the old classic joke about, the US spent how many millions of dollars developing a pen that could work in space, whereas the Soviet Union just took a pencil with them. Sometimes that looks at the heart of the value for money agenda as well, because it's challenging you to think, okay, what do we actually need here? What's actually useful here? Because yes, we could spend millions developing a pen that can work in space, or we can bring a pencil. How important is it? How much value added is it to have the pen in space as opposed to just bringing a pencil? And so it's really about decisions around how you allocate scarce resources and how you optimize, how you make the best decisions with the resources that you have to have the most impact. So that's all I would add in, I guess, on what I'd said earlier. Deep, I don't know, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got two main thoughts. So one thought, to make it very bare bones, right? So imagine I'm studying for an exam and I want to pass that exam. And the result, obviously, that I'm searching for is to pass that exam and maybe get a high grade. Now, if I only care about getting a high grade and passing the exam, I can potentially spend 200 hours studying and getting that result. But in the process, I miss out on maybe playing outside with my friends, going to the cinema, all sorts of other things, right? But equally, I could still get that high grade and pass the exam and do it with 50 hours and still have 150 hours spare to do all the other things that I've just outlined. And so what we're drawing on here is basically opportunity cost, is what we would call as economists. But I gave you an example through time, but equally it's valid through money. And actually value for money could tie one or both variables there. And I think the other key thing to remember with sort of value for money is that at the end of the day, the whole thing needs to sort of make sense from a consumption standpoint as well. So just caring about the result would be fine if we had infinite money, infinite resource. But as we know, particularly now, and it becomes really obvious when you look at the news, people are having to find savings one way or another. I should say the government, but equally it transcends to individuals like myself. And so in that world where resources are scarce and there isn't an infinite pot of money or resource, more holistically, then you have to start making these choices. And I think what the value for money framework does, or amongst other things, if you think about it, is I could justify any sort of intervention potentially in a developing country, whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in education, whether it's in infrastructure. All of these things by itself, set on a micro level, is extremely important. There'll be individuals who are extremely passionate about it, and they can potentially make a solid case for why X should happen. But I think once you start to put it on a more macro view and you're able to start to compare, then you can make some of these decisions and trade-offs, which are still going to be imperfect. But I think a framework is then allowing for you to think about it much more on a macro level. So it's, again, tying the micro with the macro. And again, it's opportunity cost. So those are the two key pillars I would really point towards.
Thank you, Deep. That was really insightful. So, just building on that, we've talked about value for money. We've talked about why it's important. We've talked about differentiating it from the results framework. But what are the challenges in driving forward the VFM agenda in international development? Because if we're highlighting all the benefits, if we're highlighting why it's so important, yet why is there tension? Richard?
So I think one of the challenges which goes with the value for money agenda in international development is that whilst there are some simple projects, most of the time actually what we're applying the VFM frameworks and the results frameworks to are not just projects. So it's not just, are we buying a certain type of vaccine and delivering it? Usually the programs they're actually programs which are a whole set full of different projects, and they're trying to do things which are all pushing towards some higher level goal or outcome. And because of that, it's very complex. The results frameworks are complex. And because of that, the value for money analysis that you have to do, or the value for money drive you do, becomes complex, can be complex in itself, and it can be overwhelming. And so what a lot of people can do is they just get completely scared of doing it, right? They just say, like, okay, this is too challenging. Let's just focus on the easier bits of this, which is, what's the cost per day of the consultant? What flight are they booking? Economy travel? You focus on the sort of the constraining costs or containing cost side of things. The challenge with that is that you lose a lot of the focus on the value, and you lose a lot of the focus on the resource allocation things, which can be incredibly helpful if you're trying to manage a program effectively. So when the value for money agenda is done well, it enables team leaders who are managing these programs to be able to use their resources in the best way possible, and it can become a really powerful tool. And if we're doing our job well in terms of supporting teams, then we're giving them the tools that can empower them to make smart decisions in how they're implementing their programs. So the challenge one is about complexity. The challenge two is also about, I think there's also something where maybe it's a human nature thing, but I think people often get a little bit scared by numbers sometimes. If there's a portion of people that are very comfortable working with numbers, and there's a proportion of people that just don't want to engage with them, or want to engage much less. They want to stick to an area of expertise which may be somewhere else or whatever, and that's fine and that's great. But actually, part of the challenge when you come in as VFM consultants is just reassuring people it doesn't have to be very complex. It can actually be quite intuitive. It can actually be things which are quite easy to relate to and easy to understand. So if we're doing our jobs well, we are building that comfort, we are building that reassurance that the value for money agenda is useful and supportive, and not just this is Deep's point earlier about art versus science, right? We're able to tell the intuition behind what it is that these indicators mean, and it's not just a tick box exercise. So I'd say complexity. I'd say individuals who work on these programs, their comfort level with handling numbers and data. Deep, I'll hand over to you for some of the other factors that might be there and the challenges.
Yeah, well, to be additive to what Richard has said, I would say incentives matter as well, right? So when you think about the exercise at large, in some ways it can feel, if you're working on a program, that you're being assessed. And obviously in that process, some people might be reticent to do it. But I would actually posit that if you were to do an assessment or a value for money stock take of how you're performing, you're actually signaling to the market, or you're signaling to everyone at large, that everything is actually being conducted in an effective way. So you can start to view it sort of like a market for lemons problem, where those who have not had it done in some ways would be signaling that maybe there's something that is actually going wrong. So that's a immediate incentive, which I think when you start to think about it should prompt people to have these assessments done. But I think the preceding factor of thinking that you're being assessed can often stop people from wanting to maybe commission it or have it done. And then the second major challenge, I would say, is, these exercises shouldn't just be an exercise to tick a box, right? I don't think anyone wants that to happen. And so once you've done these exercises, which sometimes do take some time to do, it could then prompt some changes, and these things take time to materialize. And so again, one of the challenges is some people will view such an exercise as simply ticking a box, but I think it kind of defeats the spirit of what it's trying to achieve. And actually, if you really take it seriously, not only are you able to actually save money, but you're able to enhance the impact that ultimately, as aid professionals or similar, we want to be seeing. So I would say those are the two main challenges. But actually, in some ways, if you take a step back, it should actually prompt you to maybe do more of these assessments. But Richard, I'll be curious to see or hear what you think.
Yeah, thanks. Before I forget, I just want to point two more challenges, which I think are relatively unique to international development. The first one, I mentioned sort of three of the four E's: economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and cost effectiveness earlier. Actually, so four of maybe five E's if you want to go for the larger collection of the five E's. One of the most important ones, which I missed, was equity. And I think that speaks to one of the challenges that we often have in the value for money agenda, because when you start looking at equity, you realize that not all results are the same. Some results that you're trying to achieve on a development program, whether that's helping get children into schools, helping them get better educational outcomes, whether that's better health outcomes for women in terms of maternal health or whatever, that not all results are created the same. Some are much harder to achieve than others. I'll give you an example from Nigeria, where we were doing some agricultural market systems programs. We had two programs. One was working in the south of the country, which is largely Christian by religion, has better economic development indicators along a large part of it. The other was working in northern Nigeria, which has more challenging development indicators. It's predominantly Muslim. The women's economic empowerment in the north is fundamentally weaker than women's economic development in the south of the country. And we had two programs that were both trying to work in agricultural markets and had targets set for how many women's incomes could be raised through the kind of interventions that they're doing. Now, one set of results here is much easier to achieve than the other, because it's just generally the environment and the context in which you're working in is more supportive for that women's economic empowerment to be achieved. So that would be in the south of the country. In the north of the country, it's really tough. Not universally, there are areas where it's a bit easier than others, but generally across the board in northern Nigeria, it is much tougher to get those women's economic empowerment outcomes and raise incomes. And this is the challenge you've got with VFM, because if you don't look at the equity lens, then what you tend to do is you say, right, well, this program in itself, you got, 2,000 women's income raised by 15% or 30%. The one in the north only did 1,000. That's really bad. Why are they underperforming like that? And you can't compare. It's a completely different context. And therefore, the value, it could actually be that getting 1,000 women's incomes raised in northern Nigeria is even a much more harder result to achieve than say, achieving 5,000 in southern Nigeria, right? And you've got to be able to have systems and frameworks that have that nuance to be able to distinguish and say, not just one is worse, that the northern Nigeria 1,000 women's incomes raised is worse value for money than the south ones, but actually be able to distinguish that it's a much harder task to do and take account of that in your value for money frameworks. So that's really tricky as well. That's a challenge. But good value for money, people who are doing good value for money assessments or good value for money frameworks, they will be there to help take account of some of the complexities that are in this. So I'll pass back to Deep in case there's any reflections he wants to add on to the equity point.
No, I think I actually completely agree with Richard there, right? So this comes back to, again, when I was talking about it being a painting, right? Because if you look at it strictly in a robotic sense, then you're trying to be utilitarian and you just maximize the numbers that are maybe receiving this intervention and then benefiting from it. You'll skew in one direction. And again, this also links back to what aid is partly doing. It's not, I guess in some ways people would argue it's sort of a higher, distinguished, purely, giving sort of cause, but I think at the same time there is sometimes a political choice that's also being made. And so with these political choices, obviously you're looking at it beyond just an impact in terms of numbers. It might be you're having an impact in a certain location, and that then at a macro level tempers maybe other tensions that would surface and then lead to other negative repercussions. So I think that is a key point, that just looking at it purely from a numbers basis in the short term and not actually looking at it on some of these more qualitative measures that go beyond the short term, show you the nuance that obviously we're building what is a fairly quantitative framework, but at times you do have to take into account these qualitative factors. And I do think in many good value for money frameworks, there is some weighting that is given to that. And maybe, Richard, you can kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think just building on the whole set of points around equity and the weightings that you give, I think it's the same that a lot of what we do in international development is difficult to compare like for like, right? And this is because ideally with value for money analysis, you're looking to try and benchmark things. You're looking to compare things in order to give insight. And so it's really difficult to just look at something standalone and draw big insights on value for money, because you want to immediately compare something. And if you've got apples and oranges, as the old classic adage goes, it's difficult to know what to get from that. But to be honest, whilst it's a challenge, often what you find is you're comparing one type of apple with a different type of apple. And yeah, they're differences, but there are unique qualities about the two apples which make them both apples. And so whilst you can acknowledge what those fundamental differences are, but you can still make comparisons. And to be honest, an apple and an orange, they're both still fruit. So you can still make some degree of comparison. Like, you don't have to have the perfect scientific in a vacuum setup for two different programs in order to make useful comparisons between it, as long as you acknowledge what the differences are, as long as you acknowledge what the differing contexts are. So I don't know, we've spoken about some of the challenges here. I'm sure there's a whole host more we could potentially speak about, but hopefully that gives our listeners a bit of a flavor. So yeah, back to you, Favor.
Yeah, I think I appreciated you sharing, Richard, about just realities that different aid programs have to experience. And it just brought my mind back to when we conducted a value for money workshop with one of our projects, and we had asked this opinion poll: when you hear VFM, when you hear value for money, how does it make you feel? And a lot of the emotions we got ranged from wildly negative to a little bit of optimism. But I think it just really tells a story of how implementing partners, of how program teams, how they see the lens through which they see value for money. So that opinion poll was just really telling. And I think for me, I just want to get a sense of what we as value for money experts, how can we best support teams? How can we best be sensitive to the difficult realities that some of these programs face?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I think oftentimes when I've previously gone about doing the exercise, it's really, it goes beyond just looking at program documentation. I mean, stakeholder workshops, stakeholder interaction is really key, because oftentimes there are things that aren't said on the paper that actually materially affect how a framework might be developed, right? And it could be that, say, for political reasons, certain programming will not actually work on the ground going forward. And if you were just to look at it with data from the past, you perhaps would have made a different sort of recommendation, or derived the framework in a slightly different way. And so this kind of speaks to the fact that, obviously, even if you think about the stock market as an example, past data can be indicative of future data, but it's not necessarily a perfect proxy, which is why that we oftentimes do make failings or investments that don't make sense. The same way economists do the same. So I would say stakeholder management is really key, and having that space for those conversations is really important. And then you also see within the stakeholders, different people also have different incentives, right? So some of the implementing partners, for obvious reasons, would again maybe want to see their bit of programming continue, which is obviously important to them. But then you have a program team which is looking across all bits of programming, trying to do the trade-offs and compare what is working and what is not. So again, having space to have those different viewpoints come to the surface so that you can make an independent third-party recommendation, which is, I think, one of the values of having an external set of people actually doing it, is where I would say, in particular, we can help. But again, Richard, welcome your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Deep, on that. I think if you're bringing consultants or teams to do value for money assessments or value for money frameworks or whatever the help is around value for money, if it starts to feel like an audit, something's gone wrong. It really needs to be about feeling that, when we're doing this kind of work, it's supporting the teams, it's helping the teams, helping them solve real problems, real dilemmas that they have, where often information isn't complete from no fault of their own. It's often because of the tricky environments that they're working in, and they have to make decisions. They have to make trade-offs, and they're making trade-offs on a daily basis. So if we do our job well, we are supporting them with the tools that help them make better decisions and working with them in a pragmatic way, which reflects the reality on the ground, not just some scientific in a vacuum with perfect information. Here's what we do. So, I completely agree with you, Deep, and say that, we're here to provide useful assessments. And also, when we're able to really identify where the value of the program is, it helps direct resources into where that value can be highest. But it also serves as a really, Deep, you mentioned this earlier, right? It serves as a really good sign of, okay, this program is really concerned about making sure it spends taxpayer money well. It is being very thoughtful in how it does it. And therefore, it is a program that deserves to be, in a time when resources are more scarce than they've ever been in international development, or at least have been for a very long time, then these are the kind of programs that you want to back, because these are the programs that are genuinely concerned with making the right kind of resource decisions. Very much I'd see it as the work that we do. It's not about audit, it's about support, it's about help, and it's about, in a way, it's about, I don't know what to say, whether international development hygiene. It's about making sure that you've got the basics that are working well, and we can help support around that. And if you're doing the hygiene stuff well anyway, then you're going to come out looking really good. And if not, then there's always room to get additional support and to really boost those things. And that will make your program even better going forward into the future.
Yeah, I definitely think so too. I know this might be an imperfect illustration, but I was reflecting on our role, and I think it could be like when you have a certain document and then you have editors go over it to proofread and to edit. So our work basically is to how can we make your writing even better. So yes, and I think over the series of projects that we have had, I've found that different programs have different approaches to value for money. Some are really in depth, why it feels like some are just doing the basic requirements to just ensure that they are able to achieve. But I really am curious about some really good examples of how you have seen international development programs using value for money tools. Richard?
Okay, let me cheat a little bit and let me go to when we in Nigeria, we were starting to do some portfolio level value for money assessments. So looking at a cluster of programs that we're working on different themes. So it could be a governance portfolio, could be an economic development portfolio, a health and education, a sort of basic services type portfolio. When you start looking at things across programs, there's a lot of power in that, because you start having conversations between programs where they can start sharing challenges, they can start sharing issues. Like one of the key things that a lot of programs grapple with in governance or economic development is the point Deep raised earlier, contribution and attribution. How do you handle it? What are different programs doing in terms of how they're counting results? And of course, what you find is that often there's quite a wide variation in how different programs are handling issues of kind of contribution, attribution. In very few cases, we should be using attribution, right, in terms of results, because usually there's a partner that's working on something. Usually there are others who are trying to deliver something and we're supporting or we're helping. So usually what we're talking about is a contribution, but there are levels of contribution, right? If the Nigerian government happens to make a really transformational policy decision, what was the degree of involvement from the development program? Did they just happen to be in the room when the big decision was made? Or were they absolutely crucial to that decision being made through a whole series of engagements, a whole series of evidence that was put forward, a whole series of advocacy that went around it? And there's a big difference to just being, we just happened to be around at the time when something happened and we were pivotal to something happening. And being able to have ways of documenting exactly how crucial the program's role is and having a consistent standard that can be used across similar programs, that can be very powerful. But one of the things we found was just even having the conversation around that between similar type programs started sharing their best practices. Programs that were perhaps having weaker methodologies were learning from those that had stronger methodologies. And actually the general standard was rising just by having those kind of conversations. And these things came through on the back of just looking at value for money at a portfolio level and looking at what the common issues were that were being faced by programs. And I've seen that being very successful in the past. Deep, I don't know if you want to think about some of the tools that you've seen that work well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can give you two kind of anecdotes, right? So, one anecdote I'll give you is I was doing some work in Cote d'Ivoire, and one of my colleagues basically said to me, obviously you're here and you're trying to improve the programming, all of these things, but if it showcases that it's not working, doesn't that mean that we lose out as a country? And I thought that was quite a poignant question, but I then posed it back to him. But what happens if the country is shown negatively in the sense that aid is spent in a way that is actually not contributing towards a good goal? that then biases a lot of the funding that might be attributed to the country going forward. And so you actually tend to have a strong negative multiplier, even though in the short term, you might think the country might be benefiting from it, particularly on something that's not working, right? So that's an example where I would say, obviously, as an anecdote, my colleague was then much more amenable to having that done and really try to enhance the programming that was going on. So that's one. And then I've also seen in another country context, in the MENA region, where an ambassador basically closed down a project because it just wasn't working, and that money got sent back and was redeployed. So again, when it comes back to those scarce resources we're talking about, we don't want to see that being used for things that aren't delivering impact, because fundamentally there isn't enough resource to go around to have that. So again, that's an example of where some good decision making, I believe, then led to actually a lot more people being helped and actually being supported through poverty alleviation. So those are my two anecdotes.
Thanks, Deep. I'll just add, I think one of the powerful tools I've seen is value for money frameworks. And I think one of the things that concerns all three of us here, because we've all worked on value for money frameworks. So a value for money framework for a program is a bit like a set of indicators, additional indicators beyond the results milestones that would be in a logical framework or a results framework that help tell the story around where value for money is in the program. So economy, efficiency, effectiveness, sometimes cost effectiveness, and equity. And you've got a bundle of indicators which are, as Deep said earlier, trying to paint the picture as best it can, not trying to cover everything, but to cover enough to be able to show the value of that program. Now, where these are used well, these are not just something that gets pulled out once a year, but these are indicators that are insightful and useful for the program's ongoing management. So it's not just about monitoring for VFM, it's about managing for VFM, and it's also on the back of that management, it's enabling better decisions and better impact from the program overall. So VFM frameworks, when they're done well, can be really powerful, but there are probably quite a few examples of where programs see it just as a box ticking exercise, and I have no interest in that kind of framework, because there's no point. You when you're doing a framework, you want it to be useful, you want there to be utility for it, and it's not just about systems, it's also about how things can be culturally picked up by a program and owned by a program. So when we look at value for money frameworks, we're not just looking about producing a set of indicators, we're looking about building the ownership around those indicators and having something useful for the program teams. So value for money frameworks can be really important and really powerful when they're done well. The second thing is value for money assessments. So value for money assessments are almost like an evaluation of sorts of a program. But you do make sure you're bringing in this kind of how the resources are used and the cost side of things alongside with the results as well. So you're joining them up. Now, if a program does a value for money assessment midway through, that's great, because there's time to change things and adjust things. And it can also help build support around the areas which are working well of the program. So if there are opportunities for further funding or whatever, then that helps make a really strong case around it, because you've identified what's working, what's good value for money. You've got evidence around that, and then that can lead to more funding towards it. And where things aren't working so well as well, as Deep was mentioning earlier with his example on Côte d'Ivoire, you know, there's opportunities to kind of cut back and reuse those resources in more effective ways. So value for money assessments, value for money frameworks, I really advocate as good tools for value for money.
Thank you, Deep. Thank you, Richard. So I think I want to move a bit into a controversial lane here. I think if US President Donald Trump was in this room with us, he is likely to say, oh, you are speaking my language. You are saying exactly what I'm saying. That is why I had to remove US aid, because I think he could make the argument that his removal of US aid is just an attempt at efficiency, is just an attempt at value for money. But definitely there's something he could have done better, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a provocative question. And I think there's an element of truth to that, right? Because I think when we look at government departments, and I don't think US aid just as a singular entity should be the one that's spotlighted, but governments at large, there's obviously going to be sometimes a case where all the resources internally aren't being deployed in the most effective way possible. And I think having governments come into place who want to improve these government departments is actually something, as a voter, that I actually do want to see, right? And that piece, I would always encourage government entities to even be doing that amongst themselves. Like, is it really necessary to be doing X, Y, Z? Now, in this case, what actually happened was Donald Trump and some of his colleagues, I suppose, basically overnight made a decision that unilaterally stopped everything. Now, the way it was done has massive repercussions because it's like turning, I don't know, say you're on a motorway and you're driving a car and you turn the engine off as the car is going on the motorway, you're going to end up with a crash, right? And that crash can then lead to a pileup, and you really have a massive problem there. What would have probably been more advisable is, as you're on the motorway, you maybe have identified some sort of problem. You then take your car to the hard shoulder on the left-hand side in the UK, and basically then take a stock tip of what is the problem, and you try and amend it, blah, blah, blah. So I think that there is something to be said there of the manner in which it was done. Obviously means that there are people that are going to lose out. There are going to be people who do end up hungry. There are going to be people who are really good in the industry who might then be absorbed into other jobs. And then you basically lost talent within the industry, which then causes a long-term repercussion or error or problem. So you have all of these things that come from it. And obviously, I'm not even talking about what it means on for people who might have lost their jobs and who are then struggling. I'm leaving that all aside and just looking at it from a purely macro level. So, Richard, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, was Trump's decision to close USAID a good way of handling any perceived poor value for money issues? No, very clearly not. And, I think one of the things that the aid industry has had challenges with over decades is there has been a lot of spotlight on the things that don't work. More so perhaps than any other area of government spending, there is a focus on what doesn't work. And the old adage of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, yeah, there's always going to be challenges in any sector. There's always going to be things which don't have the impact you hope for. Actually, and as there's been some good analysis done recently looking at how scrutinized government expenditure is. International development expenditure is usually much more scrutinized than any other part of the economy in terms of where, if you compare it, take an extreme, compare it with the defense sector, how much is of defense sector money is scrutinized with evaluations and all the rest. There's much more in international development, certainly in the UK, on that side of things. So there is an element of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Certain newspapers focus a lot, particularly in the UK, on the failings of international development and aid. They shine the spotlight purely on that area, and that becomes people's perception that aid is a list of waste and inefficiencies and all the rest. Of course, there are waste and inefficiencies in any area of government expenditure, right? That's why you have things like the value for money agenda, because it's all about trying to make better decisions. But throwing the baby out with the bathwater and shutting down USAID, that is not how you go about improving standards and improving impact in really complex areas, which international development usually tries to address.
If I may, can I add? And I think it's important to spotlight it's not just the US who's done this. Even in the UK, we've recently cut our aid budget. So I would say I was actually quite frankly a bit disappointed in the UK government in that regard, because I think we should have been stepping up, but we've actually compounded the problem that has been emerging. And obviously other European countries have done the same to some extent. And obviously the pragmatic truth is there is a a resource challenge in that some of this spending is being redirected towards defense. But if you actually look at it, as Richard is pointing out, in terms of how much is actually being spent and what it's being spent on, this is not going to be the thing that really substitutes the increase in, say, defense spending that is required, even though often it's presented as such. And actually, if you take the UK as an example, I think something in the magnitude of 28% of what was perceived to be aid was actually being spent on domestic issues that are emanating from maybe tough conditions in which people are living, which would actually compound why you would want to spend more money on aid in the first case, because you would actually prevent a lot of that. So rather than you giving sort of medicine to the problem, you'd be actually not even treating, you'd be diagnosing it before you are having to treat it. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Deep. So if there was one key takeaway you would like program teams to take away on value for money, what would it be?
Wow, I think that's a tough question. One key takeaway for program teams to take on value for money. I would say to take it really seriously, because the truth is that programs are very long, typically very long, right? 3, 4, 5 years. And decision making should not be done at particular points just because an exercise demands that you do it. Good decision making is actually proactive rather than reactive. So I would be encouraging program teams to take it seriously in the sense that they should be doing it and thinking about it on an ongoing basis. Just like I would think about maybe my own bills on an ongoing basis. It would be bad of me to just suddenly think, oh, at the end of the year, I'm really going to just take a stock take now. And you've probably already had a series of other outcomes as a result because you've not thought about it in a proactive way. So that would be my takeaway for them.
Yeah, I think my takeaway would be there's so much scrutiny on international development expenditure, and in a world where international development resources are more scarce than they've ever been, making sure that we're using that resource well and being able to demonstrate that we're using that resource well is more important than it's ever been. And those programs which are genuinely making efforts around this area deserve to be able to show that off. And those ones that need a bit more support, the best way to, I've seen wonderful transformations in programs that have gone from being poorly performing programs to being programs that have gone on to really make a big difference in countries. And it's because the programs took corrective action at some point during that life cycle of that program. And the programs that don't take corrective action when things are going wrong, ultimately they get caught out in the end, and they get caught out, and they don't have the impact. It doesn't achieve its objectives. Usually, they're cut short before the end of the time that they had, and people in countries lose out as a result of it because of that side of things. So, on the value for money side, I think there's really a message here about it's needed now more than ever when resources are so scarce. You're doing good work. Majority of the international development programs are doing good work, excellent work. Show that you're doing that good work. Show what wonderful impact you're having, and where there are areas to improve, show that you're willing to address those as well. And that will be a really strong foundation for the future of international development.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Deep. This has truly been a really insightful conversation. And I think for me, if there's one major takeaway from my tiny, in comparison to the both of you's experience in working in international development and the value for money sector, is that value for money helps aid programs tell their stories better. I think that's been my own experience, that by crafting frameworks, by carrying out assessments, we're able to paint a clearer picture of exactly what these aid programs are accomplishing and the impacts that they can have by making some adjustments based on the agenda.
I would go further on that favor, and I say it's not just about the narrative as well, but when you're starting to have those narratives about what's working well, the programs grow into those narratives as well. So it's not just about PR. It's not just about trying to look good or dress something up, but it's about having those really honest conversations within it and showing off where that impact really, really is.
Well said, Richard. Well said. Well, for me, this has been genuinely an enjoyable episode, and it's been fun having Deep here. And as I said, it was a conversation that went beyond just having a guest, but as colleagues, being able to share experiences within the international development and value for money sector has been really insightful and fun. So thank you so much, Deep, for joining us, and hope to get your opinion in more episodes.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yes, and Richard, you still deserve your thanks, even though we're here on every episode. But thanks, Richard, for allowing me borrow your seat. I'm too comfortable. I might never give you back, but I've truly enjoyed the hosting seats today. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Faber. You've done an excellent job. You're welcome to keep the seat.
You're too kind. Our dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Flyway Economics podcast. It has truly been an insightful time just listening, both trying to draw experience from the past and learn examples in the present. In case you are interested in the fascinating topics we cover, you can head over to our website at flywayeconomics.com. And we're also interested in hearing your thoughts. We know we covered some really hot topics, not excluding Donald Trump and shutting down US aid. So you can find us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Our handle across all social media platforms is Flywheel Economics. Well, as I said, I've had truly an enjoyable time, but it's time to hand over the mic to Richard. But that will be the next episode. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics podcast.